Welcome to another episode of Exploration Radio. I'm your host Ahmad. Have you ever heard of the company 3M? Did you know that it started off as a mining venture in 1902? It used to be called Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, and over the last 100 years or so, it has evolved into a materials company that makes all sorts of different products. Now, the prevailing opinion in our industry seems to be that mining companies should only focus on mining as a means of creating value. We like miners to be miners and nothing else. Other business streams are often seen as a distraction and probably hurt the company's perception in the eyes of investors. But what if mining companies were more than just miners? What if they recycled metals rather than just mining them? What if they helped design and manufacture products that relied on metals as the main raw material? Any technology product would fit into this space. What if mining companies were more vertically integrated, so they could take advantage of opportunities offered up by the circular economy? Would all these changes make these companies better at handling the cyclicity of commodity markets? Would it make it more sustainable? Our guest this week is Saleem Ali, an environmental planner and professor of energy and the environment at the University of Delaware in the US. His research focuses on how natural resources could be developed in a more sustainable manner from an ecological, economical, and social point of view. He joined us on the line from Delaware. Let's have a listen to our interview with him. So first of all, Saleem bhai, thank you for coming on to Exploration Radio.
Thank you, Ahmed.
So you are someone that we've been wanting to talk to for a while because I find your area of research that you do quite interesting. Just to start off, would you mind giving us a little bit of background to yourself?
Yes, so my work is primarily around understanding environmental and social conflicts between corporations and communities. And within that, I've focused on the mining industry particularly. And that's been a major thrust of my field-oriented work and also some of my conceptual work around how non-renewable resources can be used for sustainable development and what are some of the theoretical ways in which we can approach this question of non-renewability from an environmental perspective.
Okay, so does the mining industry give you a particularly good case study in that sense?
Yes, well, mining is one of those, primary resource sectors which is non-renewable on human timescales in terms of the extraction itself. But then the minerals themselves could be potentially renewable if we think about recycling and, bring in more of a circular economy approach. So mining is really interesting in that way because it has a very clear imprint on the surface of the earth, and often that imprint can be one which is long term. It's kind of indelible. And at the same time, it is a finite extraction process. And so it provides this very interesting life cycle approach to understanding an industry sector where you have to look at the initiation of a project, and within that phase, you have to think about its closure also. So it has a circularity at the project level, but then the resources themselves, when you've extracted them and you use them for economic development, that part also you want to have some level of circularity in terms of long-term development, that once the resource has been extracted, communities who are dependent on mining, what do they do afterwards? And so you have to think in different ways about circularity. So that's why mining is particularly interesting for sustainability researchers.
So if I summarize that, I guess there seems to be some quite interesting kind of avenues that all coalesce in mining. So say it's the resource is a finite resource. So it's the age-old question about the fact that as soon as you mine something, it's basically the value of it is really gone from a renewable point of view, once the resource is taken out of the ground. But I guess what I find interesting is the other aspects that you're talking about, which are the social, the environmental, as well as probably the political side of things.
Yes, yeah. I mean, often we also think about these terms in terms of what we call weak sustainability and strong sustainability. Weak sustainability is the physical aspect of a resource being non-renewable and hence using that natural capital, which you are extracting from the earth, and you're converting it into some other kind of economic capital. And that economic capital can have some kind of long-term sustainability, but the actual natural capital is depletable. So So, for example, with agriculture, the natural capital itself could potentially be infinitely renewable, at least in terms of solar energy providing enough energy to grow crops. Whereas with minerals, the physical capital, the physical natural capital is definitely finite on human time scales, but the economic capital to which it's converted later, that can be long-term sustainable. So you have, cities like San Francisco, for example, which were built originally on natural capital from gold mining in the California gold rush, but now their economies have very little to do with mining. But one can argue that had it not been for the California gold rush, you would not have had that natural capital conversion to economic capital, which has led to the growth of, universities like Stanford and others, which led to longer term economic and technical capital to be generated. So that's what we sometimes refer to as the weak sustainability aspect of something like mining. But you could think about minerals in terms of strong sustainability too. So like agriculture and forests are what we sometimes refer to in terms of strong sustainability, because the physical capital is itself renewable, and that can also lead to service sector development, right?
That's a really interesting point.
Now, with that, mining, the only way it can go in that direction is if we also have a strong recycling industry, and that we are able to bring back some of the minerals into a circular process. And that's where the mining industry really needs to transition in the long run. And that's what's, for me, currently in my work, that's the most interesting aspect of how mining is going to eventually transition towards the circular economy. And some minerals are doing much better at that. Like with the aluminum sector, we have a much more advanced movement towards a circular economy because aluminum is much more recycled. We recognize that energy cost of bauxite processing is very high. So there are economic incentives to recycle aluminum much more so. But in other cases, we know that there's very little recycling. So that's going to be the real challenge down the road. How are we going to make mining companies material service providers? They shouldn't just see themselves as digging stuff out of the ground. They're selling a commodity. Most people don't really care if the commodity is coming from a recycling plant or coming from a pit in the ground. And that transition is going to be the really interesting dimension of mining, especially for metals. The story is slightly different for things like diamonds and gemstones because there, the physical process of mining itself and where the mineral comes from adds value. But for metals and commodities, that's not an issue.
Currently, I guess the mining industry, and you kind of made the point that they haven't transitioned past what you could probably call the primary economic objective, which is, dig stuff out of the ground and sell it. The example that you gave about, say, San Francisco, yes, there was quite a lot of economic capital gained out of the gold rush, and then that was then revitalized in different industries. The birth of the movie industry in California might have had some relationship to the fact that there was this enormous amount of capital generated out of gold, and then it went into other industries like space and now arguably into high tech as well. But from that point of view, is that part of the chain that mining companies can realistically control? Or do you think that because there's the opportunity there, they should think about how they could recycle that capital into different industries downstream or secondary industries downstream?
Well, I mean, I think mining itself has the potential to diversify. We have seen that with a company like 3M, for example. 3M was historically a mining company. 3M stands for Minnesota Mining and Metals, but it is now known as a chemical company. Essentially, it's a materials company. But you come across very few examples of that. And certainly the contemporary major mining companies, the culture is very strong in terms of, we do exploration, we do mining, and we deliver the commodity to the consumer from the mine, and then that's their business. So they do not see circularity as part of their core business model, except for, as I said, for some of these companies and sectors like aluminium, where there's more recycling going on. But in terms of like seeing their role as agents of economic development, that is slowly dawning upon the industry that they have tremendous power in areas where they operate. In economic terms, we often refer to the power that mining has as monopsonistic power, where a monopoly is basically a situation where you have one seller of a resource, right? A monopsony is one where you have one buyer of a resource. In the case of mining, what are they buying? It's labor. They where a mining company operates, they have monopsonistic power over the entire labor market often.
That's a really interesting point.
So that amount of power brings some level of responsibility because you have got that power to employ people, train people, and then after you're gone, if you want to maintain a good reputation at some level, you want to show that you can create other kinds of opportunities for those communities later. So that has led to two different ways in which the industry has responded. One is by transitioning more towards situations where they do not displace communities and basically do what we call in Australia FIFO, of course, fly in, fly out, where they are not creating mining towns and so on. Or the other is where they do see their role and they're actually becoming much more involved in economic development planning and post-closure planning. And we are seeing increasingly in places like South Africa, where the mining industry sees a much more prominent role in this way, that they've created community development funds, they've created foundations, which will then provide for those communities after mining finishes. In fact, many times as part of the closure plan, there's a reskilling, a retraining of the mining labor force to be involved in other kinds of activities. I think that's the trajectory industry is slowly moving towards. It is still tall order from some of the smaller companies, but it's certainly the direction that they will need to go towards if they want to maintain a good reputation.
Yeah, intuitively, I think maybe mining companies look at their role as in that early part of the development cycle. Mining tends to be one of the few primary industries that goes into largely undeveloped areas, and they are the ones that provide a lot of capital in that space. But I guess what you're saying is there is a role for mining companies to actually be involved in more developed societies as well, because arguably the consumption of their products would be far greater in developed societies. So they have probably more of a role to play on that side as well, even though right now they probably ignore that side.
Yes, I mean, if they start thinking in terms of a circular economy, then they have to go to also where their metals and materials are ending up and then try to find ways of recovering those, and that's what we sometimes refer to as urban mining, where, the industry becomes more engaged in that whole process of recovery. Now, often when I talk to industry people, many of them get very uncomfortable about that role of, industry going to recycling. And many times they will refer to data that recycling can never meet future demand of metals, and I agree that recycling on its own currently cannot meet future demand of metals. Indeed, we need more exploration investment in order to be able to meet metal demands for green technology, especially for climate change mitigation. So moving to transition to solar and wind, we will need more exploration. So it's not a zero sum game that if we have more recycling, we will have to do away with exploration. The demand is going to be so much that we will need to continue in both directions. But ultimately, if we want to move more from weak sustainability to strong sustainability, we will need to bring recycling much more part of our business model. And that means just what you said, going to your demand centers for recovery, not just focusing on your supply centers, which is what the industry currently is doing. So, the exploration at some level should also be happening in those areas where the scrap metal is located. But that ties into much bigger conversation around product design, how the material is used. Is it used in modular form where you can actually extract it out of the product more easily? And that's the area where the industry needs to be much more engaged with downstream players as well. And I would say some vertical integration in the industry would be useful in that regard, where, you have mining industry more engaged with also the product sector.
But I guess the argument against that, from a company point of view, would be that as a primary producer, you're very beholden to things like economic cycles. So Arguably, I guess companies would say that they have a tough time right now managing their business in a fluid economic commodity cycles. Is that a reasonable excuse why they might not have branched out into these other secondary or later stage kind of industries?
No, I think it would build greater resilience for them in that way, because if they are more involved in the service sector of recovery of metals, then they do not have to be as beholden to the revenue stream for large scale commodities being sold from mines. Because, large mines are huge investments and they incur a huge amount of debt. And as you know, from exploration to production, the percentage probability of a successful project is very low, often less than 10% of, projects even in fairly advanced exploration lead to a mine being developed.
That's right.
So the risk is actually much greater if they don't diversify. And I think if they were to be more diversified, and there were some mining companies which used to be in that space. There was a company called Falcon Bridge, the Canadian company, which later got, bought by others. But Falcon Bridge had a smaller subsidiary, another mining company before, which used to be independent, called Noranda. And Noranda, at the time, was involved in recycling as well. They had a plant which actually took apart computer circuit boards in Rhode Island, where they would extract metals from that, and that was part of their business. But because they're part of such a huge, larger conventional mining company, eventually that business kind of fell off. So I think that's the challenge. The scale has to be managed. That when there's a role for government to give incentives for companies also to maintain that scale and diversification, and see that there is value in strategic minerals and encouraging that. That's one of the things we've argued for in a report we did with Columbia University recently on what we call smart mineral enterprise development, where we're trying to get public-private partnerships around targeted exploration and recycling efforts, so that where companies and investors are not seeing the value in terms of immediate returns, government is able to provide the right incentives in order to do so. I mean, one of the challenges we have is because the most of the mining companies are operating in terms of publicly traded companies, and the reporting of their stock performance, they have a very short term planning horizon for reporting their results. And a lot of these issues that we're talking about require a much longer term planning horizon. So that requires that public private partnership model to be successful as well.
I guess that's a really good point that you made. Currently, mining companies are very supply constrained. So I've always found that a little bit weird that the only way that this company can provide their main product into the market is through mines. And surely the amount of investment, not just in building them, but also running them, leaves you more susceptible to economic cycles. So your point is a really valid one, that if you branched out and recycled, then you could probably add a few more supply streams to the market, which you could then flex depending on what economic cycles you have.
Yeah, and plus you could be involved in the service of actually procuring that material, and that's where government plays a role, because governments can create markets for servicing. The whole waste management industry has come about because of government regulations, and now it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, right?
That's a great point.
So, it's a matter of how you see the world in terms of your vision. Companies initially were very resistant to that. But now having an environmental health and safety division is part of the business model. And there is a whole bevy of consultants, many living in Perth, who just service that sector, right? It's just, that's how we need to think about these things. And that's how economies grow.
You care to comment, why do you think there is such a hesitation in the industry itself to go down this path?
It's a matter of corporate culture. I mean, there's a lot of pride in being a miner, and physically bringing material from the bowels of the earth. There's a certain bravado which comes out of that. I take it as a very valid sense of pride that people have. It's a tough job, and the ones who do it, they deserve our admiration. But that leads to a certain inertia. That leads to a sense that, well, who are these people who've never been in a mine to tell us what to do? So that's where, people like me hopefully can be helpful, because, I have worked in industry, I have worked in the trenches too, but I have also this broader interest in sustainability. That kind of inertia is very common in a lot of industries. With mining, it is perhaps more so because it has been a very focused sector with people working in remote areas and having that monopsonistic power also that I mentioned.
So I guess that's a really good point. I mean, I always find it interesting that if you look at kind of the major companies out there, like, take Amazon, for example, and they're trying to do as much as they can to not only horizontally grow their product line, but also vertically grow their product line. So you look at these kind of companies that are trying to become the everything company. And I guess, like mining, you find people trying to go the opposite way, which is that they want to become very niche, but very good at that one niche.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's there are also these very, again, short term changes that lead to demand calibration. Like gold is a huge problem in that way, because from a societal needs perspective, gold is not that important. Of course, small amounts of gold are important in lots of things, but jewelry is the main consumer of gold. This is not to say that we shouldn't have gold mining. We certainly should have gold mining, especially from a development perspective, because the whole jewelry industry creates a huge, supply chain which provides livelihoods and jobs all over the world. However, in terms of exploration investment, I don't see why more than half of exploration investment should be going into just gold mining from a societal perspective, when there's more gold above ground than below ground by some estimates. We've already mined so much of it, and much of it is lying in bank vaults. And
that's a great point.
So from an industrial ecology perspective, gold mining does not make that much sense, because gold is eminently recyclable. There's so much of it out there in terms of supply, but the economic incentive is not there to look for other things, because gold is so profitable when you have a high price for gold. People who go to meetings like PDAC, their interest was gold, because that's where you could get the highest return on investment. But from a societal perspective, it was overblown. You could have some of it, but it was definitely overblown. So, that's where the challenge lies.
So that's an interesting point, that there will be some commodities where we probably don't have to mine or recycle that, to fulfill society's needs in the future.
Yes, yeah. But I think what the other thing I've argued for is that when we choose mining, opportunities and where mining happens, we need to do an assessment of what are the opportunity costs? What are the other kinds of industries, development paths that a particular area could take? It would make sense to engage in mining for gold in areas where there is very little other livelihood opportunity available. But given the environmental and social cost often of gold mining, it should not be attempted in areas where we have many other potential economic development paths available. That is why we are seeing, in some cases, countries like El Salvador, deciding to have a moratorium on mining, because they see other kinds of economic development opportunities. It could be tourism, it could be forestry, it could be agriculture, it could be coffee, which they feel are more strong sustainability oriented. And so I think in terms of the decision making for mining companies as well as for governments, where to go for mining, that has to look at these big picture issues. It cannot be just about, well, we found an ore deposit and hence we have to develop it. Many times you need to prioritize, and we do that. I mean, if we found a huge gold reserve under Perth, we're not going to suddenly go and mine it out. It is going to be a prioritization about whether there are other economic development paths which clearly are more appropriate. So the same logic should be applied to macro level planning for mining and using it for a development path, particularly for commodities like gold.
In my limited understanding of, say, other natural resource industries, I think they probably do a better job of looking at these macroeconomic effects. Would you agree? Like forestry seems to be a little bit more advanced than mining.
Well, forestry, they already have the advantage of being a renewable sector upfront.
That's true.
But the forestry sector also has had challenges in other ways with competing land uses. And compared to mining, they use far more land. And so, same is true of palm oil, for example. The amount of quantity of land used by these sectors of agriculture, agroforestry is much larger than mining. So that's where mining has an advantage because it's more concentrated in terms of land access, and land itself is a resource in terms of what you could do with it.
Yeah, that's right.
So the opportunity cost is physically about, so with forestry, often it's more about, whether you're going to be developing real estate or residential settlements, factories, other things in places where forests may exist. So but the forestry industry has also had, serious challenges with the NGO sector. They have had, a lot of opposition. Some of it comes from the issue of monoculture, of, not growing a wide range of tree crops. It has to do more with biodiversity related issues where you can crowd out native species by growing commercial forestry species. So each sector has its own challenges, but you're right, mining has had a particular challenge because of the non-renewability aspect, and also because the industry has been more insular, and also the consumer is more removed from the product.
That's a good point, actually. That's a really good point.
So that makes it a bit more challenging.
I think one of the things that probably the industry does very poorly is have a direct link to the consumer. I mean, yeah, if more people knew how much metals and materials that mining provides are fundamental to their existence, I think they would have a completely different view of mining.
Yes, yeah, I think that's important from the point of view of creating a positive image of the sector, and that has been done to some degree. The main challenge is often that the mines themselves are physically far from a lot of major urban centers, and so people don't have the first-hand exposure to them. So also what they read about the impact of mining then gets often caricatured as well. The impact is very real, but often it's presented in a very polarized way without, considering the benefit as well. And then, a lot of the issue recently with mining has been that the coal sector has had a particularly negative coverage in public discourse because of climate change concerns. So a lot of coal mining has been conflated with other kinds of mining, the kind of land use impacts of coal mining, as well as all the impacts of fossil fuel production more generally. They tend to get lumped together with mining more generally in the public's perception. And, that's something that has to be also looked at in terms of the role of energy minerals versus commodities, metals.
Your comment is that I think the industry has these challenges, but I think, maybe the industry itself could have overcome them. Like I always argue that mining really needs the organic food movement or the equivalent of that in this industry. I think people are now a lot more conscious of where they get their food and, like how they're getting it after this whole organic food movement kind of blew up. And I think mining needs that as well, because I don't think the industry has done a very good job of kind of making those links for people.
Well, I mean, there too, they have tried, and certainly there are so many certification programs for minerals, especially for gemstones. I mean, we have for diamonds the Kimberley process on conflict-free diamonds. We have also with gold, there's the International Cyanide Code, in terms of how gold is more responsibly produced. Even recently now, Tiffany and Company just announced last month that they're going to provide the origin of all of their diamonds over a quarter carat, to give that consumer the sense of, okay, you're getting responsibly mined diamond. Here's the story of the diamond, where it's coming from. It's going to be much more challenging to do with metals. With the copper, I know at one point Rio Tinto was able to track the copper that they've used in the roof of a project they did in the UK called the Eden Project. It's a kind of nature tourism center of sorts, and it was built in an old quarry site in Cornwall, England. All of the copper, they were able to track it from the Bingham Canyon mine in Utah all the way to where it was refined and then made into the roof, and but that's very rare. I mean, it's definitely possible to do it. It may seem overwhelming to the industry to do it, but I think that that's going to be the wave of the future. Being able to have some confidence over where you are getting your particular minerals from. It happened by default from a punitive perspective, like if there's sanctions against a country, if there are concerns of like cobalt coming from, we know more than 60% comes from Congo. Well, we have to make sure that it's produced responsibly, so there are no sanctions imposed on DRC. Those kinds of things. It's happening more in those terms.
Well, I guess that's the part I find interesting is that the industry does it only when it's regulated or forced to do it. Why wouldn't they take the front foot approach and actually do it as a transparency point of view? Like, surely you would get a little bit of goodwill or economic premium out of that.
Yeah, I think so. I think they should pay more attention to it. I mean, part of it is also just the way in which the entire supply chain infrastructure for metal, especially, is so multinational, and it's going, literally halfway around the world from the mine to where it's being processed and refined. They just feel so daunted by it. And I personally think that even the siting of the mineral processing plants needs to be done with more ecological efficiency in mind. By ecological efficiency, I mean by situating them close to clean power sources and considering the transportation cost of taking metal ore from the mine to where it's going to be processed. A lot of times government subsidies and other political considerations led to siting decisions which did not necessarily consider these kinds of ecological costs. Also, for future infrastructure for mineral refining and processing, if we were able to situate it with those kinds of factors in mind, that would make things also much easier.
I mean, I think that's a fascinating point here because one of the things I find is the way the mining is kind of looked at right now in society is, it's the conflict between the need for development, mining development, versus the need for preservation. I don't think it really helps the industry if the argument is expressed in this binary terms that it's either development and environmental destruction or it's environmental preservation and no development. I think the conversation probably has to move past this.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's why, I have found this area very ripe for engagement is because there are some very visceral conflicts over these issues. And if scholars of sustainability can provide opportunities from a science-based perspective to bring corporations and communities together to see, well, these are the win-win opportunities. These are the areas where there is likely to be some choice being made on where you do extraction, then you can have, potentially much more fruitful engagement. So, right now, a lot of mining projects are currently stalled because of community conflicts. And if we had such an approach, which is more long-term oriented, we could have, I think, more success. The reputation of the industry could also improve.
I think that's exactly the right point. As an industry, we often look at the challenge of mining development as a technical one, and we kind of ignore these non-technical issues, especially long-term non-technical issues. Adoption of a strategy where you take these in play as you're going through the development cycle, or have more awareness of it, of how you could actually play a role in this. I mean, intuitively, it will probably lead to a better result for companies as well as communities.
Yes, absolutely.
So I guess one question I had is, do you care to comment, why is it that when we talk about mining, we often talk about the caricature representation of mining companies as well as environmentalists, I should say. Do you care to comment why it's such an entrenched view?
Well, I think it has to do with the history of mining and how it has led to a concentration of wealth in certain sectors, and it has exacerbated inequality, and that has led to perceptions of mining as being an industry which is removed from the social development imperatives. That doesn't need to be correct, but that has been the case. I mean, South Africa has been classic case in point. I mean, we have the great mining barons like Cecil Rhodes who have been, archetypes of a certain, prejudicial kind of nationalism. And aggrandizement of wealth, and that the same is true in the US. You had, what they call the robber barons era of a lot of these people who accumulated enormous amounts of wealth. Now, in both cases, they later became philanthropists, and we have the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, and we have the Guggenheim Museum in the US. And, these were people who made their wealth on mining, Guggenheim on lead mining, certainly, the Carnegies on steel. And so, I mean, so this has been part of the challenge for mining gaining a reputation problem. Also, from a labor perspective, I mean, mining is a very difficult industry in terms of the impact on the labor force from a health and safety perspective. And so there has been a very negative history of, abuse of the labor force of mining. And that has changed, thankfully. But within the US, the whole, labor rights movement, people like Mother Jones, who was legendary, was a, labor activist, found their roots in the Appalachian coal mining regions where there was a lot of exploitation of the labor force. So that's been a real challenge for mining. It's been slowly trying to overcome it. I think there are some great success stories of mining economies that have done quite well, like Chile. But again, it has the highest inequality of any South American country. Or I should say, Chile has the highest inequality of any of the OECD countries. That's particularly significant. So, those are the kinds of concerns we have to be aware of.
I mean, this might be an obvious question, but do you think mining is then a prisoner of its history in a lot of ways?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it has a legacy problem, as we call it. And we have to address that legacy issue upfront, saying, yes, we've had a sad past, but we can have a better future. I mean, the sugar industry had a terrible past. Most of the slavery in the world was done for sugarcane farming. Now people don't think of sugarcane as a bad industry. They were able to go beyond it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the fashion industry or apparel industry used to have a checkered past as well. Yeah, there's quite a lot of industries, primarily manufacturing of finished goods, which have had a checkered history, but they've all seemed to have progressed past that.
Yes, yep, absolutely.
Before we finish, we always ask our guests these two questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is, what is something in mining that you think should die? Something could be an idea, a concept, a behavior, something that you think we should jettison out of the industry.
Well, I think within the industry, this sense that they are somehow, have an exceptionalism around being a sector which is able to provide a resource that no one else can provide, and hence has to just focus on, the primary extraction process. That needs to go. Of course, mining and extraction from the earth is important, but ultimately, mining companies should consider themselves as material service providers, and they should be willing to consider whatever supply streams they can get for those materials that they are selling. And I think that would really help us transition towards a more sustainable future long term for the industry.
I mean, I think that's a fascinating point because if you look at how disruption affects people, the more highly specialized or niche you become, the more likely you could be to be disrupted completely out of business or out of existence. So I think it's really short-termism for the industry to think that that's the avenue to become more and more robust as an industry. I just don't think it makes sense.
That's right, exactly.
So the last question that we have is, what do you think is something that the industry should keep at all costs? So something that you think is fundamental to the industry and we should never get rid of.
I think that sense of wonder, of being willing to go to the most daunting frontiers to look for resources, that should be maintained. But I would urge that the industry to think of frontiers not just in terms of, distant lands and asteroids and so on, but also think about exploring urban frontiers, product frontiers, and thinking in terms of a circular economy. But that is an amazing attribute of miners, that they have that courage, that conviction to take high risks, and that's something to be cherished. I think not many industries have that level of risk tolerance and sense of adventure and exploration that mining has.
So you think that pioneering spirit is something that we should maintain at all costs?
For sure. Absolutely.
Exploration Radio is brought to you by Steve and Ahmad. This episode was produced and edited by Ahmad and recorded at Vision Studios in Perth. If you want to find out more about this podcast, check us out on explorationradio.com or follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. And we're even on Instagram. And if you like this podcast and want to help out, well, there's two things you can do for us. Give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And consider supporting us in producing more of this content. You can find the details on how to do that on our website at explorationradio.com/support. Until next time, let's keep exploring.